April 12, 1945, 9:30 hours, Westerbork Transit Camp, Drenthe Province, Netherlands. The scout car slowed on the approach road. Lieutenant Colonel Stock could see the outline through morning mist, watchtowers rising against flat Dutch sky, barbed wire catching pale sunlight, the geometric severity of a compound built to contain. It looked, he would write later, like a penitentiary. 4 guard towers. Perimeter wire in neat, methodical coils. Barracks in rows. But no guards. No movement on the towers. Just silence. The engine idled. Gravel crunched under tires. Behind them, the South Saskatchewan Regiment held position, rifles ready, expecting resistance. They had been fighting through the Netherlands for weeks, clearing towns, pushing the Wehrmacht back toward Germany, liberating villages where Dutch flags appeared in windows the moment Canadian boots hit cobblestone. But this place was different. The wire was still up. The towers were empty. Intelligence officer Lieutenant Cade scanned the compound through binoculars. No movement. Germans pulled out? Looks like it. They had been briefed on Westerbork, a transit camp, possibly operational, possibly abandoned. What they hadn't been briefed on was what transit camp meant. Not a POW camp. Not a labor camp. A staging ground. A place where human beings were sorted, counted, loaded onto trains and sent east. 100,000 souls had passed through those gates since 1942. Most of them never returned. The soldiers of the 8th Reconnaissance Regiment rolled through the gate first. Then the South Saskatchewan Regiment followed. Boots on gravel. Rifle bolts clicking. Eyes scanning windows, rooflines, shadows. Expecting ambush. Expecting mines. What they found were faces. Hundreds of them. Pressed against Baroque windows. Staring. They expected liberation to feel like victory, cheering crowds, embraces, joy. Instead they found silence. Caution. Fear that this might be another trick in a war built on deception. The first prisoner who approached was a man in his 50s, gaunt but composed, wearing civilian clothes. He spoke English, broken, careful. You are? Canadian Army. 2nd Division. The man's face didn't change. He nodded once, as though confirming something he'd been told to expect but hadn't dared believe. How many? Stott asked. 900. Maybe less. The Germans left yesterday. Are you in charge? Someone has to be. His name was A.D. Van As. He had been a civil servant in the camp, one of the few Dutch nationals allowed to work there. When Commandant Jemiker and his SS guards fled on April 11th, abandoning the camp as Canadian forces approached, the prisoners had gathered in the main hall and voted. Van As would take temporary command. Not because he wanted it. Because someone had to keep 800 terrified people from descending into chaos when the front line arrived. Stott walked with Van As toward the main compound. The barracks stretched in rows, wooden structures orderly, identical. Between them, prisoners stood in small groups, watching the Canadians with expressions that were not quite relief. Not yet. What is this place? Stott asked. A sorting station, Van As said. They brought Jews here from all over the Netherlands. Held them for a few days. Then put them on trains. Trains to where? Van As looked at him. East. The word landed flat. Poland. Auschwitz. Sobibor. Bergen-Belsen. Names that hadn't yet entered public consciousness, places that existed only in whispers and rumors. The Canadians knew camps existed. They had seen evidence of Nazi atrocities as they pushed into Germany. But standing here, in this place that looked almost normal, almost humane, was different. Because Westerbork wasn't a death camp. It was a waiting room. And that made it worse. If this moment already feels like stepping into a different war, stay with us. What these soldiers found will redefine what liberation meant in 1945. Rachel Bloemendel had been in Westerbork for 30 months. She was 23 years old. She had arrived in October 1942 from Amsterdam with her parents and younger sister. They had been classified as permanent residents, a category that meant exemption from the weekly transports that left every Tuesday for the East. Her father worked in the camp's metal shop. Her mother in the kitchens. Rachel in the hospital as a nurse's assistant. They had watched thousands come and go. They had learned not to make friends with the transients, the people who arrived on Monday and were gone by Wednesday. When the Germans fled, Rachel and the other permanent residents knew liberation was coming. They had heard the artillery in the distance for days. They had seen Jemiker burn documents, pack his belongings, order the last SS guards to strip the camp records and evacuate. On the night of April 11th, the watchtowers went dark. The perimeter guards vanished. And the 800 remaining prisoners, mostly Jews who had survived by being useful, by having protected status, by sheer luck, sat in their barracks and waited. "We didn't know if they'd shell us," Rachel would later say. "We didn't know if the Canadians knew we were here. We didn't know if anyone cared." When the scout cars rolled through the gate at 9:30 on April 12, Rachel was in Barrack 67 with 17 other women. They pressed against the windows and watched khaki-uniformed soldiers move through the compound, rifles at the ready, cautious. One of the women started crying. Not from joy. From exhaustion. From the sudden, overwhelming realization that they had survived. Lieutenant Stott entered the barrack unannounced. Knocked first, a small gesture, but it mattered. The women stood. "Anyone speak English?" Rachel raised her hand. "Some." "Are you all right?" The question was procedural. Standard. But it landed with weight because no one had asked it in 3 years. "Are you all right?" As though their well-being mattered. As though they were people, not numbers. "We are alive," Rachel said. Stott nodded. "Medical officer is coming. We'll get food in. Red Cross is on the way." Rachel translated for the others. The women didn't cheer. They sat down on their bunks, metal frames with thin mattresses, the same bunks they'd slept in for years, and waited. Because survival had taught them to wait. To not trust sudden reversals. To remain cautious until the situation clarified. Westerbork had been designed as a refugee camp in 1939 by the Dutch government, built to house Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany. Irony upon irony, a sanctuary that became a trap. When the Germans invaded the Netherlands in May 1940, the camp continued to operate under Dutch administration. Then in July 1942 the SS took over. Westerbork was redesigned. No longer a refuge. A Durchgangslager, a transit camp. From July 1942 to September 1944, 93 trains departed Westerbork. Each train carried between 500 and 3,000 prisoners. Destination: Auschwitz, Sobibor, Theresienstadt, Bergen-Belsen. Over 100,000 Jews, Sinti and Roma passed through. Only a fraction returned. The camp itself was designed to be deceptively humane. Families were housed in small cottages with 2 rooms, a hot plate, a yard. Single inmates in barracks with communal bathrooms. There was a school. An orchestra. A hospital. Cultural activities. The Nazis wanted compliance, not resistance, so they created the illusion of normalcy. Work hard, stay useful, maybe you'll be safe. The weekly transports became routine. Every Tuesday the trains arrived. Every Tuesday names were called. Every Tuesday families were loaded into cattle cars and sent east. The permanent residents, about 2,000 Jews deemed essential for camp operations, lived in this liminal space. Not quite free. Not yet dead. They ran the kitchens, the workshops, the hospital. They enforced order. And they watched. And Frank had been here. August 1944. Transferred from Amsterdam after her family's hiding place was discovered. She spent 3 weeks in Westerbork before being loaded onto one of the final transports to Auschwitz on September 3. She died in Bergen-Belsen in February 1945, 2 months before Canadian soldiers walked through the gate she had passed through on her way to death. Captain Cecil Law, mortar platoon commander with the South Saskatchewan Regiment, entered the camp an hour after the initial liberation. He was 25 years old, from Saskatchewan, a farmer's son who'd enlisted in 1939. He had fought at Dieppe, Normandy, through France and Belgium. He'd seen combat, seen death, seen what war did to cities and soldiers. But this was different. "It brings home," he would write in the unit war diary, "what we are fighting for." The barracks were clean. The prisoners were not starving. Food supplies, though rationed, had been adequate. The medical facilities were functional. Compared to the concentration camps being liberated further east by Soviet and American forces, Westerbork looked almost civilized. But that was the point. Westerbork wasn't designed to kill. It was designed to prepare people for killing. To organize them. To make the machinery of genocide efficient. Law walked through the kitchens. Met the prisoners working there. Watched Canadian soldiers help peel potatoes. Young men from prairie farms working beside Jewish women who had spent 3 years in captivity. The absurdity of it. The normalcy of it. War stripped down to its essentials: hunger, labor, survival. It's surprising, Law noted, the influence girls, especially pretty ones, have with soldiers. The comment was typical of the era: casual, observational, slightly condescending. But beneath it was something else: recognition. These were people. Young women. Human beings. Not abstractions. Not statistics. People who laughed and flirted and peeled potatoes and had somehow, against all odds, survived. David Zielke was 31 years old, head of field services, one of the camp's Jewish administrators. When the SS fled, he had been tasked with meeting the Canadians. He walked out toward the approaching scout cars, unarmed, hands visible, shouting in broken English, "We are Jews. We are prisoners. Don't shoot." The scout car stopped. A soldier stepped out. "You speak English?" "Some. We are Jews. Germans gone." "How many of you?" 800. "Maybe more." The soldier radioed back. Within an hour, the full regiment arrived. Zielke led them through the camp, explaining the layout, the population, the situation. The Canadians moved methodically, clearing buildings, checking for booby traps, securing the perimeter. Standard procedure. But no one knew quite what to do. Liberation doctrine didn't cover this. Camps, yes. But transit camps? Places that weren't sites of mass murder but conduits to it? "The people want to leave," Zielke said. "Can they go?" The Canadian officers conferred. The problem was practical. The war wasn't over. The northern Netherlands was still occupied. There was fighting 20 kilometers north. Letting 800 civilians move freely through an active war zone was dangerous. And there was another concern. Intelligence wanted to know why these 800 had survived. Were there collaborators among them? Informants? People who had traded others' lives for their own? "For now you stay," Stott told Zielke. "We'll get Red Cross in. Food. Medical supplies. But you stay." Zielke translated for the assembled prisoners in the main hall. The reaction was muted. Relief mixed with frustration. They were liberated. But they were still behind wire. Over the next hours, the Canadians conducted a systematic inspection. Stott visited the kitchens, adequate food stores, organized, rationed. The medical room, basic supplies, functional equipment. The barracks, clean, orderly, identical. In his official report, he would note, the food and medical supplies were found to be in fairly good condition. This was not Bergen-Belsen, where British troops found tens of thousands dying of typhus and starvation. This was not Dachau, where Americans discovered piles of corpses and walking skeletons. Westerbork's prisoners were thin but not emaciated. Frightened but not broken. Yet the horror here was different. Subtler. It was in the railway siding just outside the camp, where the trains had arrived every Tuesday. It was in the lists found in the administration building. Names, dates, destinations. Meticulous records. Bureaucratic precision. The machinery of genocide reduced to paperwork. One of the soldiers found a film canister in the commandant's office. Inside, footage of the camp shot by a Jewish prisoner on SS orders. It showed daily life, prisoners working, children playing, cultural performances. Propaganda meant to show that Westerbork was humane. But it also showed the trains. Cattle cars being loaded. Faces at windows. The last images of people hours away from death. The soldier handed the canister to an officer. "What do we do with this?" "Keep it." Evidence. The Westerbork film would become one of the most important visual records of the Holocaust. Decades later, historians would study every frame, identifying faces, tracking fates. It would be evidence at war crimes trials. It would be shown in documentaries. But in April 1945, it was just a film canister in a liberated camp, proof of something the world was only beginning to understand. Miriam Levi was 19. She had arrived in Westerbork in December 1943 from The Hague with her mother. Her father had been taken earlier, sent east on a transport before the family was reunited at the camp. Miriam and her mother had survived by working in the camp laundry, protected status, essential labor. Her father never returned. When the Canadians arrived, Miriam was in the laundry building folding sheets. She heard the engines, the shouting, the sudden rush of activity. She stepped outside. Saw the khaki uniforms. The maple leaf patches. The rifles slung casually over shoulders, not pointed at anyone. A Canadian corporal saw her. Young, maybe 20, with a farm boy face. "You all right, miss?" "Mississippi." "Not Juden." "Not prisoner number." "Miss." "Yes," Miriam said. "Thank you." "You need anything? Water? Food?" "No. We are fine." The corporal nodded and moved on. Miriam stood there, holding a folded sheet, trying to process what had just happened. A soldier had asked if she needed anything. A soldier had called her Miss. A soldier had treated her like a person. I didn't cry when the Germans left. I didn't cry when the Canadians arrived. I cried 3 hours later, alone in the barracks, when I realized I didn't have to be afraid anymore. The Canadian forces that liberated Westerbork were part of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, veterans of some of the war's hardest fighting. They had landed at Dieppe in 1942, a disastrous raid that cost the South Saskatchewan Regiment heavily. They had fought through Normandy in 1944, clearing Caen, closing the Falaise Gap. They had liberated villages across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. They had seen devastation. They had seen death. But they had not seen this. The camps being liberated in Germany by American and British forces were extermination sites, places of active mass murder. Westerbork was something else. A logistical hub. A place where the final solution was organized, not executed. And that required a different kind of reckoning. The Canadian soldiers didn't have a script for this. There were no cheering crowds. No flowers thrown at liberators. Just 800 exhausted people staring at them with cautious hope, waiting to see if this liberation was real or just another phase of the nightmare. Private James McLeod, 19, from Cape Breton, wrote home, "We found a camp today. Jews. Hundreds of them. They've been waiting here for years, watching their families get sent away. We gave them chocolate and cigarettes. They didn't know what to do with them. I don't think they believed we were real." If you're beginning to see why this liberation was as much about restraint as rescue, subscribe now, because what happened next shows the complexity of freedom when trauma runs this deep. The Canadian military government faced an immediate problem: what to do with 800 liberated prisoners in the middle of an active war zone. The decision was made to keep them at Westerbork temporarily. For security. For vetting. For logistics. The prisoners who had just been liberated were told they could not leave. The irony was not lost on anyone. But the Canadians made changes immediately. The watchtowers were left unmanned. The barbed wire remained but the gates stayed open. Red Cross supplies arrived within days: food, clothing, medical equipment. Prisoners were allowed to remove their identification badges. The word Jude was no longer worn. They were civilians now. Displaced persons. Free but confined. For many, the liberation felt incomplete. Rachel Bloemendel later recalled, "We were happy. But we were also trapped. The Canadians treated us kindly. But we were still behind wire. And every day we waited for news about our families. Most of the news was bad." By July 1945, 3 months after liberation, the last prisoners were finally allowed to leave Westerbork. Some went to relatives in the Netherlands. Some emigrated to Palestine, to America, to anywhere that would take them. Most discovered that the families they'd been waiting for would never return. Of the 102,000 Jews deported from Westerbork, fewer than 5,000 survived. After the war, the Canadian government and military did not publicize Westerbork's liberation. It was a footnote. A minor action in a massive campaign. The 2nd Division moved on, liberated more territory, accepted Germany's surrender on May 8 and went home. The South Saskatchewan Regiment was disbanded in December 1945. But the men who were there never forgot. Cecil Law, the mortar platoon captain, returned to Westerbork decades later. He saw the memorial, 102,000 stones, one for each person deported. He saw the museum built on the site. He saw the Dutch schoolchildren learning about what happened there. And he understood, finally, that Westerbork wasn't a small victory. It was witness. "We were very proud to be Canadians," Law said in 2005, 60 years after the liberation. "Not because we won a battle. Because we saw what needed to be seen. And we remembered." The soldiers who liberated Westerbork were not heroes in the traditional sense. They didn't storm machine gun nests. They didn't charge under fire. They walked through a gate, found 800 people who had been forgotten, and treated them with basic human decency. That was all. That was everything. Today, Westerbork is a memorial site. The barracks are gone, demolished in the 1960s. In their place, a radio telescope, ironically, listening to the universe. But the railway siding remains. The path the trains took. The place where cattle cars were loaded. And the stones. 102,000 of them. Each representing a life sent east. Each a person with a name, a family, a story. Each a reminder that Westerbork was not an anomaly. It was a system. And systems require cooperation. Bureaucracy. Paperwork. Ordinary people doing ordinary jobs in service of extraordinary evil. The Canadians who liberated Westerbork understood something that April Day in 1945, that the opposite of evil is not heroism. It's restraint. Decency. The small choice to see a person as a person, even when the system has spent years insisting they are not. If this story has shown you that liberation is more than opening gates, that it's about restoring dignity one act at a time, then share it. Because the lesson of Westerbork is not that good triumphs over evil. It's that even in the worst circumstances, small acts of humanity matter. In 1993, a former Westerbork prisoner living in Canada came forward with a story that had been buried for decades. On the night of April 11th, as the SS fled and Canadian forces approached, he had escaped the camp and run toward the advancing troops. He found a Canadian artillery unit preparing to shell Westerbork. They believed it was a German military installation, a last-stand defensive position. He shouted, "Life!" Explained in broken English, "Jews, prisoners, don't shoot." The artillery unit halted. Radioed back. The shelling order was cancelled. The man's intervention saved 800 lives. But he never spoke about it publicly until 1993, when a Dutch historian found fragmentary records and tracked him down. By then he was 70 years old, living quietly in Toronto. When asked why he had stayed silent, he said simply, "I did what anyone would do." But that wasn't true. Most people would have stayed in the barracks, stayed behind the wire, waited for liberation to arrive on someone else's terms. He ran toward the sound of war and changed the course of 800 lives. His name is not widely known. There are no statues, no medals. Just the knowledge that on one night in April 1945, one man's courage and one Canadian officer's restraint prevented a catastrophe. That is the real story of Westerbork's liberation. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just the small, essential choices that separate civilization from chaos. The war ended 4 weeks after Westerbork's liberation. In the Netherlands, Canadians were celebrated as liberators, still are 75 years later. Dutch families name children after Canadian soldiers. Cities hold annual commemorations. The bonds formed in 1944 and 1945 endure. But Westerbork survivors had a more complicated relationship with liberation. Freedom didn't erase 3 years of captivity. It didn't bring back the families sent east. It didn't undo the trauma of watching trains depart every Tuesday, knowing where they were going, knowing you might be next. Rachel Bloemendel emigrated to Israel in 1947. She married, had children, built a life. But she never spoke about Westerbork to her family. Not because she was ashamed. Because there were no words. How do you explain what it feels like to survive when everyone else died? How do you explain gratitude mixed with guilt? In 1980, she returned to Westerbork for the first time. The camp was gone. The radio telescope was operating. She stood on the spot where Barak 67 had been and tried to remember what it felt like the day the Canadians arrived. "I remember being afraid," she told a reporter. "Afraid they would leave. Afraid they were a dream. Afraid I would wake up and the Germans would still be there. But the Canadians didn't leave. They stayed. They provided food, medical care, security. They treated the prisoners not as victims to be pitted but as people to be respected. And slowly, over days and weeks, the fear began to lift. That," Rachel said, "was the real liberation. Not the gates opening. The fear leaving." In the end, Westerbork's liberation was not about one heroic moment. It was about a series of small necessary acts. A scout car slowing at a gate. A soldier knocking before entering a barrack. An officer asking, "Are you all right?" A corporal calling a prisoner miss. These were not grand gestures. They were the baseline of human decency. But in a world that had spent 5 years systematically destroying that baseline, they mattered. The 876 people liberated at Westerbork on April 12, 1945, were not saved by heroism. They were saved by luck, by timing, by the Germans fleeing before they could destroy the evidence. But they were treated with dignity by soldiers who understood, instinctively, that liberation is not just freedom from captivity. It's restoration of personhood. And that is why the story matters. Not because it's dramatic. Not because it's triumphant. But because it reminds us that in the machinery of war, in the logistics of genocide, in the vast, impersonal systems of violence, there is always room for one person to see another person and choose humanity. The Canadians who walked through Westerbork's gates that April morning did not think they were making history. They thought they were doing their jobs. Clearing a camp. Securing prisoners. Moving on. But to the 876 people waiting behind the wire, they were the world. They were proof that somewhere, beyond the trains and the transports and the watchtowers, civilization still existed. That restraint still mattered. That one person's life still had value. That is what the Canadian soldiers gave to Westerbork. Not freedom, exactly, but recognition. The acknowledgement that the people behind the wire were worth saving. Worth treating well. Worth remembering. They braced for the barbed wire to remain. It did, but the towers stood empty and the gates stayed open. Not liberation by force. Liberation by presence.